Hi, in this talk I'm going to be discussing science and technology, communication, and popularization. I'd like to begin this talk by reading a quote that appeared in a commentary piece from Nature in 1937. The reporting and interpretation of science fails of its purpose if it does not bring about an appreciation and utilization of scientific method in everyday life. This is best achieved by giving the mass of people, through accurate and interesting accounts of science's successes and failures, some understanding of the essence of science, which would lead them to apply it more widely to their everyday life, human relationships, business, and government. The essence of this quotation has a lot to do with how the public engages with science, and inherent in this quotation is the idea that scientific understanding, scientific appreciation needs to somehow be disseminated to the public, or there need to be means of the public to engage with and understand these scientific concepts. And that is the realm of science communication and science popularization. I'm going to start by talking about the broad concept of science communication. Now, on a kind of at its core, or where science originates, there's communication within science communities. This is where scientists communicate with each other. Often this is in the form of journal publications or presentations at academic conferences. Of course, a lot of what scientists communicate to about each other has relevance to the public, and many scientists engage with the public. This could be through science lecture series. This could be through other means of communicating with the public and learning what interests them and how to satisfy their curiosity. Of course, a lot of this engagement also occurs through the media, and so there's communication occurring among scientists, the public, and the media. Of course, scientists also often communicate with the government. Scientists often advise the government on new science-related policies, and of course the government communicates with the public. There's communication about new policies, explaining to the public the basis of those policies, and then also governments do a lot of work in, for example, health communication to promote good health behavior, and that involves some two-way communication, understanding the behaviors, the attitudes of the public, and developing interventions, developing policies around those. And of course, those are based on science. And then there's one additional perspective that looks at communication between the public and industry. And this has a lot to do with how the public uses technology and how the technological devices we use, for example, this presenter, it has a laser in it, and I can understand this device more, or I might feel inclined to learn more about some of the technologies because I own this device, right? And there's so many devices we use on a daily basis that are rooted in science, and very often we learn a little bit about science by using those devices. And so that's the link with industry. And so this is a broad conceptualization of who is involved in science communication. They're the scientists, public, media, government, and industry. There's another way of thinking about science communication, talking more about the types of science communication. Of course, there is communication between scientists, and this is where scientists share knowledge with each other. I mostly already covered that. Then there's also science education. Now, science education is something that can occur in the classroom, in a formal learning environment, but it's also something that happens in informal learning environments, like at science museums, aquariums, zoos, etc. It also happens in science lectures, public science lectures. Those are examples of science education, and often science education involves scientists and the public engaging with each other and talking about science. Next is spreading technology. This is the link with industry, members of the public engaging with science through the technological and scientific devices they use on a daily basis. And then finally, and kind of at the heart of this lecture, is science popularization. And so science popularization involves communicating with the public about scientific ideas and technological ideas through popular channels of communication and using accessible language. That means the language used is easy for audiences to digest. It isn't complex, right? And so it's about kind of bridging the gap between science and the general public, making it more accessible. And many aspects of science education involve popularization. Many aspects of spreading technology also involve science popularization. But one issue with these depictions of science communication and popularization is that they really focus on the what of science communication, what is science communication, what are the different types of science communication, and not so much on why there should be science communication and popularization, and not so much on how to engage in effective science communication and popularization. This man is John Desmond Bernal, and he was an Irish-born scientist who dabbled in a wide range of scientific disciplines and made some interesting and valuable discoveries across a number of different fields. He also wrote extensively on the history of science and also was really interested in the notions of science communication and science popularization. And he had a couple critiques, I guess, or concerns, really focusing on why good communication is important in different types of science communication. So, for example, one issue he had was the communication between scientists. He recognized that as science progresses, the sheer volume of scientific knowledge is impossible for any one individual to contain in their own memory. And even a small fraction of what is known about even one discipline is very often difficult to for one individual to know. And so it's really important for scientists not to have an extremely broad understanding of science, but to have a focused understanding of the specific aspects of science that are relevant to them. And his idea was that basically science should be really accessible, specific science, relevant science should be accessible to scientists. There should be some sort of searchable index. Of course, he was an active scientist in the 1930s. This was before the internet. Nowadays, scientists have exactly those searchable indexes where they can use keywords to find the research that they need. But he recognized that there was a growing need for such means of scientists to communicate better with each other. Of course, this point is beside the point of this talk. Rather, the focus of this talk is on science education and popularization through science communication. And he said that this type of science communication is extremely important because science is so relevant in everyday life. Plus, having something to do with the sheer volume of scientific knowledge, there is a growing gap between science and the public. If it's difficult for scientists to have a very broad understanding of all of the science that may be relevant to their lives, it's probably even more difficult for a lot of members of the public. And so there is a need to communicate effectively and to engage with the public on the issues that are of particular relevance to their lives. And about the importance of science communication, Bernal had this to say: science will never really be popular unless all citizens at some part of their lives, and many citizens throughout their lives, play an active part in scientific research themselves. The factual content of science is essential, but it is not sufficient. The method of science can, for most people, only be grasped in its application. And so an important aspect, an important part of science popularization is really engaging the public in practicing science and really becoming scientists themselves, at least for the experience, at least to understand the process of science better. And that links up very neatly with the ideas of science literacy, which I've talked about in some of my other lectures. And so Bernal was interested in this idea of why should there be an emphasis on good science communication. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about how to engage in good science communication. There's the Ae Iou model. Those are the vowels. This is an easy mnemonic device. This was a model of science communication developed by Burns et al. And their model was focusing on how the public responds to science communication. There are a number of different ways the public can react when they encounter science communication. And these are ideal positive outcomes, and to the extent they can be achieved, that is how to go about effective science communication. So in this model, the A stands for awareness. Effective science communication can raise public awareness of the breadth of scientific issues that are relevant to their lives, and they gain an appreciation of the role of science in their lives. The E is for enjoyment. Through effective science communication, members of the public can have positive emotional experiences, have fun, really. The I is for interest. Now that's related to enjoyment, but it's more about motivations to learn and satisfy curiosity. And these are things that effective science communication can do. They can spark that curiosity. The O is for opinion formation. So effective science communication can help people form opinions on scientific issues, which can then affect their decisions and their behaviors. And then finally, the U is for understanding. Now, this is different from awareness. Awareness is basically gaining an appreciation of scientific ideas and recognizing the relevance of science in life. Understanding of science is more about scientific literacy, knowing specific concepts or the content of science, understanding the scientific method, and also understanding the role of science in society. And so these are 5 different positive responses the public can have to effective science communication. Now, Burns et al. Took this example a bit further with a metaphor, thinking about how interest and achievement in science grows. And they used the metaphor of climbing a mountain, mountaineering. And there are many parallels between the idea of approaching the sport of mountaineering and engaging with science. So for starters, it's useful to think of the mountain as the scientific discipline. Of course, there are different mountains. I didn't draw them, but you can imagine they're there, and each of those mountains reflects a different scientific domain. There's the elevation, so the higher up the mountain you go, the more you scale the mountain, the greater the scientific achievement, the better the understanding of that scientific domain. Mountaineering, basically the set of skills and abilities to scale the mountain, has a lot to do, or it runs parallel with the idea of science literacy. And then there are the guides who teach those skills, who teach how to mountaineer. The metaphor there, of course, is science communicators who can help the public develop their science literacy. And then there's the equipment. Now, in the metaphor that I've read, the equipment is ladders. I guess ladders can be useful in mountaineering. There's all kinds of other equipment. That equipment is parallel to the media and other channels of communication, because that's the means of utilizing or conveying and utilizing the skills and conveying and utilizing science literacy to achieve. And then finally, there's monitoring. So a guide will pay attention to the progress of the climber and give feedback and ask how they're doing, if they need to take a break. And that runs somewhat parallel to the idea of dialogue between the science and public and scientists understanding each other's perspectives where they stand. Now, something I really like about this metaphor is the idea of, well, basically what happens if you don't make it to the top of the mountain. And in the diagram I created, the ladders don't make it all the way. And let's just say the climber only makes it up to the first or second base camp, and there are a few base camps further where they could go. Well, it doesn't mean that they've failed just because they didn't get to the top of the mountain. They did make progress. They have some scientific achievement. They've developed new skills. They've developed some science literacy so that the next time they try to scale that mountain, or if they try to scale a different mountain, it will be easier and they'll be more likely to succeed. So just as in developing science literacy, just because somebody doesn't completely understand a scientific domain the first try, they probably pick up some new ideas, knowledge, and insights that helps them approach it from a different angle the next time, or even helps them approach other scientific domains. And so I like that metaphor. Now, one last thing I'd like to talk about is the importance of interpersonal communication. The first diagram I showed just had the public as a node by itself that interacted with the other nodes, with scientific community, media, government, industry. But there's a lot of communication that happens within the public, and that's where a lot of interest in science arises and a lot of conversations about science happens. And I'd like to relate this idea to the notion of opinion leaders, because that's a really important place where scientific ideas can spread from one influential individual to the masses. And it's easy to imagine how this works. I mean, you're familiar with the concept of influencers, where an individual who for some reason has been identified as having a valuable opinion or perspective, when they promote an idea, it quickly gains traction among large audiences. And the same thing can happen with science communication, where an interesting idea can start with one influential individual who then shares that knowledge with other people, and depending on how central that individual is within social networks and how important they are in terms of helping other people form opinions, that scientific idea can spread quite rapidly. And this relates to the theory of the diffusion of innovation by Rogers. And this is a theory of how ideas spread through the public, where an idea will first be adopted by a group of people called innovators. And this also applies to technologies. It's easy to think about this in terms of maybe the newest smartphone, right? Some people buy it immediately because they want the newest and best device. Other people purchase it later, perhaps after reading the reviews by those innovators. Well, the same idea applies to all kinds of ideas, including scientific ideas. And this is a good theory to explain that. There are the innovators and early adopters. These people acquire these ideas early on, and they tend to be fairly influential in their social circles because people look to them knowing that they tried this product or tried this idea out first, and they want to see how it's working for them. Subsequently, there's the early majority and late majority. These are large segments of the public who adopt the idea or the behavior or the electronic device. And then finally, there are laggards who are reluctant to change their mind despite all of the social processes that are going on. And then there are a couple relevant points that this curve shows. So first, if you look on the curve right around here, you'll see that there's an inflection point where the steepness of the curve picks up quite dramatically, and that's been referred to as the tipping point. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called The Tipping Point, discussing that phenomenon where all of a sudden an innovation becomes highly interesting or highly relevant, and a lot of people start to adopt it. It's this critical mass of adoption where suddenly the adoption rate takes off. And something that drives that tipping point is the stickiness of an idea. So ideas that people see as particularly relevant, particularly useful or informative to their own lives, their own perspectives, ideas that they can orient to and that make sense to them, those ideas are stickier because they remember them and they're more likely to share those ideas with other people. And so stickiness is a really key idea when developing effective science communication and in trying to engage in effective science popularization. Then the last point I want to make about the diffusion of innovation is it is a social process. And one of the key findings in my own research looking at why people watch science videos on YouTube, one of my key findings is that people are very much influenced by their perceptions of their social environment, believing that watching science videos on YouTube is socially acceptable, and also perceiving that people in the immediate social environment, like friends and family, perceiving that they watch science videos is a powerful motivator of individuals to watch science videos. And that helps explain how this diffusion process works. Individuals need to see other people engaging in a behavior to feel like it is normal, to feel like it is acceptable and something they should engage in. And of course this happens with things like smartphones, but it also happens with science communication. So that's all I wanted to talk about in this lecture on science and technology, communication, and popularization. Thank you for watching.